Democratic leader, South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn. Good to have you back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sam Stein, we promised.
Sam Stein's in Washington, D.C. We heard a few audible grunts during the Zeke debate, but he couldn't get a word in. Sam, first question to you.
Yeah, let me apologize for the audible grunts. And then, Congressman, to pivot off of that last conversation, because it was a very, a live one, let's say theoretically that the Supreme Court does take out the rule on constitutional health care law and says that the whole thing has to be made invalid. As a politician and someone who is involved in crafting the bill, what do you do next in terms of legislative counter-proposals, and also politically? How do you pivot off of something that would be such an obvious defeat? It was the signature policy of the administration has now been totally void by the Supreme Court.
Well, I was often practicing politics. What I learned as a child, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. And so if this were to be declared unconstitutional, I think that the Congress, the President, will all take a look at what the decision says and see whether or not things can be done to fix it. And I would hope that that would be our approach. Rather than sit around and agonize over it, we ought to consider exactly where we are as a country, where we should be in having everybody insured, and see whether or not the Supreme Court gives us a roadmap as to how to get there.
Just a quick follow-up, though. There's been talk about, sort of going after the court as an activist court, as a conservative activist court. Is that something that is entertainable, or is the court off limits in terms of politics?
Well, in terms of the Congress, I believe that it would be off base for us to do that. But for the President, I don't think it is. I think the President ought to take a look at what in years we've seen presidents run against Congress, and we've seen presidents run against the Supreme Court. Franklin Roosevelt did it to the Supreme Court. Truman did it to the Congress. I think that the President would take a look at exactly what he needs to do to connect with the American people, let them know that he's done everything that he can possibly do, and ask them to give him a mandate for the years going forward.
Congressman, if your friend the President said to you, Jim, things are looking pretty good for my re-election, what are 3 things I should be worried about, concerned about in terms of making sure I win? What are the 3 things? Well,
I'm not too sure he has control of all of those things, but he has to be concerned about the economy overall, whether or not it begins to stall and start a downward drift. He has to be concerned about gasoline prices. And I think the President has to be concerned about the so-called enthusiasm gap. Those 3 things, I think, are very, very important. I do believe, however, that there is no real enthusiasm gap. I think that what has to be done is we've got to connect with our base and make sure that we get them out.
Steve Ratner?
Congressman, what you didn't put on your list of 3 things was health care, and every poll seems to suggest the American people do not love Obamacare. There's a pretty big gap between those who like it and those who don't. So how does he, regardless of what the Supreme Court does, how does he run on health care? How does he deal with the health care problem?
Well, I think he has to deal with what he has done. The fact of the matter is Obamacare takes on a connotation that some people seem not to be all that enamored with. But when you start talking about getting rid of discrimination because of pre-existing conditions, you start talking about removing caps, lifetime caps on benefits. These things people very much care, or kicking people off the insurance policies, keeping your children on into the 27th birthday. All these things people love. And I think that the President will have to go out and say to people, this is what we've done. When we talk about civil rights in this country, I often hear people say, the Civil Rights Act did this, and which one? It did one thing in 64. It came back and did voting in 65. It came back and did housing in 68. It came back and did the public sector in 1972. The so-called Civil Rights Act are 4 distinct acts done over 8 years. That's what I think we're going to have to do with health care. So the President will go out and say, this is what we've done. We tried to go further. We couldn't go any further. We'll take that step the next time. Put me back in office, and we'll come out and do the second step.
Hey Jim, you talked about civil rights, front page of the New York Times in the eye of the firestorm.
Yes.
Talking about the Trayvon Martin case. So many people, I believe, out there have seized onto this case, and we've seen bad behavior on both sides, and there's no need to mention the bad actors, some who have apologized for their bad behavior on both the left and the right. But for me, this isn't about George Zimmerman. He deserves due process.
No.
And let the courts, and I'm sure you agree with me, let the courts figure it out. For me, this is about a Sanford police operation that held a dead teenage boy for 3 days, without even notifying the parents when they had the cell phone, who acted in questionable ways up and down the line. It's not the individual. Zimmerman, he will be judged by his own peers. It's that a police department would do this to a young African-American male. Talk about your biggest concerns in this case.
Well, Joe, I think it's even broader than that. I think it's a culture there. Remember that the police department, for some strange reason, brought the prosecutor into this on that evening. And I'm told, I've read, that the prosecutor ordered the lead investigator not to file charges. So it's even the police department. There's a culture of a justice system there in Sanford that seems to be running amok. And so I think that we need to have a broader discussion of this. And that's why I feel very strongly that we have to get beyond this affinity that we have for discussing race. We need to have an open discussion of race in this country.
How can this not be about race? Well, some people say it's not about race. How can it not be about race when everybody listening here knows that if an older African-American male had shot a 17-year-old white boy, the African-American male would be in jail, and the 17-year-old white boy's parents would have been called. We work really hard not to make presumptions, not to make generalities, but if you've lived in this country more than 20 years and you don't know that to be the case, then you're either willfully ignorant or you're a fool.
That's true, and I've got almost 72 years in this country, so I know that is a real problem for us. Look, I will never forget a lady, I talk about her often, Rowena Tobias, who lived down in Charleston, who said to me one time, she said, you know, Charleston used to lead the economy in this country, but we lost our way because we would talk about every problem we had in Charleston except the problem of race. She says, until we can have an open discussion of that problem, we will never get it behind us. And so I think that for some strange reason, we seem not to want to go there. We aren't going to solve the problems of health care without talking about them. We aren't going to solve the problems of this economy without having these open discussions about them. So why would we think we will solve the problem of race by hiding it under the rug? There must be an open discussion of this, and people need to be able to vet and get this behind them. Yeah. And so I always testify to Rowena Tobias for calling me into her parlor one day and said, promise me, as you go forward politically, not to stop talking.
All right. Thank you so
Congressman
much.
Jim Clyburn, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good to see you.
You know, it's funny. Nobody ever told me not to stop talking.
Yes.
Just the opposite.
But I want you to talk about race. I want you to
say stop
and
talking,
he does
Joe.
quite well.
That's quite true.
I don't interrupt him or wrap him up. Sam Stein, thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
right
Jim.
back.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.